Previously on Bourbon Moth Woodworking. Alright, so last time I told you that I discovered that in the Midwest, people like to float these cattle troughs down the river. I also discovered that that's not nearly as cool as it sounds because it looks like this, which is just a bunch of people sitting in a cattle trough. I knew that this couldn't stand and I had to do something to remedy it, so I went to my local farm store and I bought myself a cattle trough. I brought it back to my wood shop and I started cutting pieces of plywood and attaching it to the cattle trough using rivets, because what else are you going to use? I really had no plan, I just was trying to make it look like a boat, so I added a bunch of pieces of plywood, I added some ribs, and then I started layering on some 1/4 inch marine grade plywood for the outside. This was harder than it looked. Once I had the plywood on the outside, I flipped the entire boat over. Then I added a 1/2 inch marine grade plywood bottom, to the bottom. This had a bunch of seams and wasn't probably going to be watertight, but I didn't really care because I was gooping everything up with a ridiculous amount of Thixo that I got from Total Boat. I sanded everything smooth and then I flipped the boat back over, and this is where it got really crazy because I poured this expandable flotation foam in the bow of the boat and it went like this. And then I cut that all smooth. After that, I added another 1/4 inch plywood top to the boat, and that's where the video ended. It looked something like this. Now we have to make it pretty. So after getting my 1/4 inch top on there, stapled in place and gooped up with Thixo, it was time to trim all the fat. And by fat I mean the excess little bit hanging over the outside. Now as you can see, there is still a lot of exposed plywood on every surface of this boat, which is going to be a problem because plywood likes to act like a sponge and soak up water. So the next thing I needed to do was make sure I covered up and sealed all that exposed plywood. I started off by sanding everything smooth. I don't know why, but I actually really enjoy sanding when it comes to boats. It's just fun to make them look all fresh and clean. After I had everything sanded for the most part, I had Craig help me lift the boat up onto some sawhorses. This was really just to give me an easier working height so I didn't have to be crawling around on the floor like a hamster. Or a gerbil. Or something else that crawls. After we had the boat up on the sawhorses, it was time to cover up all that exposed plywood. Every single seam needs to be covered with some trim. For the trim, I decided to use mahogany, because this boat is made out of a cattle trough and it deserves the best. Also because I just happened to have a bunch of mahogany laying around that I wasn't using for anything else. Now the first thing I started working on was the bow of the boat. I didn't really know what to do here, so I just started cutting pieces of mahogany, and my thought was to just glue and screw them in place, and once I had enough mahogany on there, I could just kind of shape it with my Rotex. Now, I didn't want any exposed screws, so before I screwed it to the bow of the boat, I drilled some holes so that I could countersink those screws and plug them later, so they will be hidden forever. I decided to start my screws before I tried to hold it in place. This was just going to make life easier when it came to actually sinking those screws. So once I had all the screws started, I lathered up the other side of the board with some more Thixo because, well, we've already put about 20 pounds of Thixo into this boat, might as well put a couple more. Then I sank in those screws. Now these aren't just going into 1/4 inch plywood. If you remember back to the other video, there's actually a solid wooden bow behind that plywood. So there's plenty for those screws to grab onto. Now you might be looking at that and thinking, that doesn't look very good, there's a big gap on the front. But don't worry, I'm going to come back to that later. For now, I moved on to trimming the other exposed plywood edges. For this, I just ripped some mahogany down until it was just under 1/8 of an inch thick so that I could actually bend it around the curve of the cattle trough. I started at the bow of the boat. As you can see, those bow pieces I put on are thicker than the trim, so it sits nicely behind that bow trim. And then I just worked my way along, stapling that trim piece in place. I'm using staples because I'm ultimately going to be painting this entire thing, and staples are just a great way to hold the trim in place until the Thixo dries. And I'll come back and I'll fill all those staple holes later. Now I didn't have pieces of mahogany long enough to go around the entire boat, so I had to do some rudimentary scarfing of pieces together. If you don't know what a scarf joint is, it basically means that you cut a steep angle on two pieces and then glue them together. That angle gives you more surface area, which should make it a stronger joint. I say rudimentary scarf joint because I didn't use a scarf joint jig on the table saw to cut a really long angle. I just used my miter saw, which only goes to 60 degrees, so it wasn't much of a scarf. But I still think it'll work, as long as I goop it up with enough Thixo. You guessed it. Once I had the entire upper portion of the boat all trimmed out, I moved to the lower portion. For this, I just cut a scrap piece to get that angle just right, and then I transferred that angle onto a longer piece. I pre-lubed it with some Thixo over on my workbench, and then very carefully, I started just trimming out that bottom edge of exposed plywood. Now, if you're looking at that back portion of the boat and thinking in your head there's still going to be some exposed plywood on the very bottom of the boat, what's he going to do about that? Well, don't you worry your little head. I have a solution, and we will get to that in a little bit. But for now, I want to tell you how then I went back with some more Thixo. I basically used it as caulking compound, and I squirted it in every little crack and seam, and using my finger, I just made sure there was nothing that wasn't sealed. Pretty soon, I had the entire boat trimmed out, and now it was time to go back and fill the zillion staple holes I had created while hanging that trim. So I squirted out a big pile of Thixo, and yep, I just put it in every single little hole. I'll come back and sand this all smooth later. And I promise, that's the last time I use Thixo on this entire build. That's actually a bold-faced lie. I've just said Thixo a lot already, and we're only 6 minutes into the video, so I just want you to keep watching. I'll try and keep the Thixo to a minimum. With all those staple holes filled, I went back to the bow of the boat, and I had to add one more piece of wood that I could stick on the front and really shape this into a nice-looking, well, bow of a boat. So I sanded the front part of that bow flush so I had a nice surface to use a marine glue to glue another piece and screw it in place. It was going to take a while for that marine glue to dry, so while I waited for that to happen, I decided to flip the boat over and start working on the bottom. So I lifted up the back end and Craig slid out the sawhorses. Once we had the entire thing flipped over, you'll see why the bottom needs a little bit of work. Because there's a lot of seams and transitions going on. It goes from the metal stock tank to the wood bottom, and that wasn't long enough, so I had to put a seam there. And then you have the seam of the trim onto the plywood, and you got this nice little groove around the outside that's, well, needing to be filled with something. That's where this stuff comes in. It's called Coat It. It's a waterproof epoxy sealer and protector, according to the label. And there's even a picture of a guy in a boat right here, so I'm pretty sure this is exactly what you're supposed to use this for. And the brand name's Goop, which is just cool. My thought process was by coating the entire bottom with this Coat It Goop stuff, it would basically unify the entire bottom, get rid of all those seams, and really seal everything up very nicely. But before I could start pouring this on the bottom, I had to create somewhat of a dam using tuck tape. Now it was time to mix the two-part Coat It together and start smearing. It's actually a pretty cool system because the big can has enough room for you to pour the little can into it, and then it still has enough room for you to mix it all together without spilling any over the side. And it's really easy to mix if you just get one of these paint mixers and attach it in a drill, and you just, well, I mean, you can see because I'm showing you a video clip of what's happening. It mixes together pretty quick. And once you have it all mixed up, all I had to do was carry it over to the bottom of my boat and pour it out. No wonder this company is called Goop. This stuff looks like Godzilla had a sinus infection. Anyways, once you get it all poured out on your surface, you just take a squeegee and you slowly start working it around. Now it's self-leveling, so even though it looks a little suspect right now, the more you start moving it around, it'll really start to level out, and pretty soon you have a nice frosted layer. Everything sealed together, everything as one. The next day I came out and it was nice and hard, and all I had to do was peel off that tuck tape and I had a perfectly smooth, unified bottom. I'm talking about the boat, not my own bottom. Although that too is pretty smooth. Anyways, speaking of smooth, next I got out my sander and I sanded down all those filled staple holes and any remaining tape. Now, I left all the bow pieces long on the top and bottom for this very reason. I figured it'd be much easier just to come back later and flush cut them rather than trying to cut them to the exact perfect height to begin with. With the bow cut flush, I finally needed to make some plugs to fill all those screw holes. So it was over to my drill press and I used this plug cutter from CMT Tools. They come in a variety of different sizes, and yes, they are available on my website. There's a link in the video description. After I cut a good number of plugs, I went over to the bandsaw to free them from their prison, and then I filled each of the corresponding screw holes with just a dab of this specialty marine epoxy gluing agent. Once that gluing agent was dry, I could finally start sanding and shaping the bow of the boat. This is kind of fun because you really can take it from a big chunk of glued together wood to this nice streamlined looking, well, cattle trough. But cattle trough or not, you have to admit it's starting to look pretty darn good. Look at that bow. It almost looks like I knew what I was doing. With everything sanded that I could sand on the bottom portion of the boat, I decided to flip the entire thing back over and start sanding and working on the top. This time I didn't have Craig to help me, but I managed to get it flipped over. But then when I decided to try and raise it up onto the sawhorses myself, well, things got a little bit more difficult. I really didn't want to drop the boat or ding up that bow that I just freshly sanded. And then the sawhorse fell over when I had the boat up in the air. So I had to hold the boat up in the air with one hand and then try and grab this sawhorse, which is not light, with the other hand. Thankfully, I'm incredibly strong. Eventually, I got the sawhorse in the right position and I lowered the boat down onto the sawhorse, and whew, why did Craig have to take the day off? The back was much easier because, well, physics. And boom, I had the thing lifted back on sawhorses and I was ready to keep beautifying it. The first thing I did when I flipped it over was flush trim the top of the bow and sand that smooth. There are a few little places I needed to fill with a certain marine epoxy, but I'll get to that after I'm done sanding. Now I'm painting this entire thing, so I was much more concerned about everything being smooth than I was about maintaining the veneer on the plywood. So there are a few spots that I burned right through the top layer of veneer, but that's okay, because it's going to be painted and you're never going to know. I slowly just worked my way around the entire outside surface of the boat, and pretty soon it was ready for paint. But before you can paint, you always have to tape things up. It's this really annoying thing. You're ready to paint, you're excited to paint, you want to just grab the paint, but no, you gotta tape first. Anyways, to paint the boat, I'm first gonna put on a layer of this Total Boat topside primer. This is gonna ensure that I get nice coverage when it's time to paint, and it'll really soak into that plywood so my paint will go much further. Now I'm applying my primer and my paint using a method called rolling and tipping. It's where you roll out the paint really, really thin, and then you go back over it with just the tip of the brush and you tip it out. This gets rid of all the air bubbles or any impurities, and it gives you a nice, smooth, almost spray-like finish. You just gotta go slow and don't use too much paint. That is key. Small amounts, very thin. Pretty soon I had the entire boat primed. Now the primer dried pretty quick, and after it dries I sanded down the entire thing to make sure it was nice and smooth, and then it was time to start putting on the Total Boat wet edge paint. Now this is a super high gloss paint and it looks absolutely fantastic once it's all on there and dry. I mean, look at that thing.
Dude, what the heck are you doing? I'm trying to sell stuff from my brand. It doesn't even say your company name, it just says buy from me. Well, I know, but I kind of thought that maybe they'd drive up here and ask me about it and I could sell them some stuff. Why don't you just get online and create a website with Squarespace? It's incredibly easy. A what now? What's a website? Just go to Squarespace. They have a zillion templates to choose from. So I can just get on there. Well, what if I want it to look a real specific way? That's what I'm saying. There's a ton of templates and all the templates are customizable. So you can literally make them look like whatever you want them to look like. Customize it to your needs. And they look pretty professional and cool. What if I don't want to just sell online? What if I want to sell online and also sell to people in person? Can I do both? No, you can totally do that because with their point of sale, you can take orders from people or sell stuff to people in person and it automatically changes the inventory on your website. So it's no hassle, super easy. No, but you don't understand. I've got so many products. I don't think that a website would be big enough to hold them all. No, I don't think so, man. You can put unlimited products up there. Literally as many products as you want, so you'll never run out of room. Oh. Dude, just go to squarespace.com/bourbonmoth woodworking. You'll get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Just use coupon code bourbonmoth woodworking. I just use coupon code bourbonmoth woodworking? Dang, that's pretty good. You want to ride somewhere?
Now I know what you're thinking, a solid white boat. Well, that's pretty vanilla. Get it? Because vanilla's like, people say that when it's white and the boat's white. Anyways, don't worry. It's not going to stay white. That's just the base color. I'm about to turn this thing up to 11. And by 11, I mean give it a very amateur level paint job to try and make this cow trough look cool. But where could I go wrong? I decided to add some stripes and some accent colors. The colors I'm using are red, white, and blue. Even the foreman was on board. I mean, not literally on board. He's standing next to the boat, and if he was on board, he'd be, well, on the boat. But he was okay with the paint scheme that I had proposed. Red, white, and blue, and perhaps some stars. After I got some sort of central line taped down the middle, I decided that I wanted to do a few more lines all the way around the outside of the boat. Now, I didn't know how to do this. I've never painted the exterior of a car or a boat or an airplane trying to do cool lines, so I just got out a tape measure and measured up a certain distance. Eventually I abandoned the tape measure and just cut a piece of wood and used that to mark around the outside, and then just kind of using my eyeballs, I wrapped the tape around, trying to hit my pre-marked height. Was it perfect? Definitely not. But it was looking pretty good. And then I took some green tape that was a little skinnier and I decided to do another line right below that. Again, I just used my eyeball. I didn't even mark or measure this one. I just kind of looked at it and said, yeah, cool. I think that looks straight, which I'm sure is how the professionals do it. I mean, I can't think of any other way that they would. It's not like I own a laser level or anything. Oh, wait. Anyways, for doing it by hand with my eyeball, I thought it looked pretty darn good. Next, I wanted to add some more stripes to the top. So I had Craig help me and I put a piece of that skinnier tape right down the middle. And then I took some other tape that was even skinnier than the skinny tape and I put a piece on either side of that middle piece, if that makes any sense. But I made sure not to overlap on top of that middle piece, and you'll see why here in just a second. Once I got the first piece of tape on the left, I added another piece of tape on the right, leaving just the tiniest of gap between my outside pieces of tape and that inside piece of tape. And then once I had the outside pieces of tape on, well, I just got rid of that inside piece of tape. See? Just using it as reference. I gotta think that's how the professionals do that, right? And if they do it that way, then I'm sure they go down to the craft store and they buy some cardboard stars to get the stars they want on there, because that makes sense. I got this little package of cardboard stars and I picked one out that I liked the size and shape of, and then I cut it out with an X-Acto knife. Now, I couldn't just use this one star because I wanted multiple stars. So I used a little double-sided tape and I stuck the cardboard star onto a roll of blue tape. And then I very carefully cut around that star until I had a bunch of, well, blue tape stars. I figured now all I got to do is stick them on top of the boat. So I carried my homemade star stickers over to the boat, and using a ruler, I measured and marked until they were perfectly even, and ooh, stars. Now the next thing I needed to do was paint everything with white paint. No, don't worry, I'm not doing white on top of white. I understand that that would be very boring and pointless. You see, if you've ever tried to tape something off before and then paint over the top, you've probably got a little bit of bleed out. The best way to avoid that is before you paint your color, go over your tape lines with your base color. This will seal up all of your tape, and if there is any bleed out, well, it's the same color as the base color, so you're not going to see it. While I waited for that white paint to dry, I had to do something that every boat needs, or else it's bad luck, and that was give this vessel a name. So very carefully, again by hand, I drew on some nice lettering and I started penciling in the name. But I'm not going to tell you what it is yet because, well, there's really no reason except I am in total control of this video, and if I want to make you wait, well, I can make you wait. And I decided to exercise that power, so you're just going to have to wait. With my white paint dry, it was time to start putting down that color. For this, I just used a brush, doing nice, thin layers and long, even strokes. I did red, I did blue, and, well, that's really all I did, because I only had those two colors. I was going to say white, but, I mean, that one's pretty obvious. So anyways, I did red and blue. While I waited for my paint to dry, I decided that I better take out this outboard motor that I previously bought on Amazon and take a look at it. Now, I bought the most expensive outboard motor that Amazon had to offer. It was this Hinawachi Hanahuku Himalayan rock salt. I don't remember the brand name, but, well, it's not one you've ever heard of. Anyways, it's a 6.5 horsepower. There was just one little problem. The shaft was not long enough, which means that the propeller would be out of the water if I used this particular outboard, which sucks because it's the only outboard I had. But not to worry, a few phone calls later and we found a used Mercury Pro Kicker outboard 9.9. which is actually a higher horsepower than our Amazon outboard and a nicer motor. Crisis averted, it was back to the shop to start peeling tape. And oh, was it coming off so nice and crisp and bear attack. Clean. I mean, look at those lines. That's what you get when you paint over the tape first with a base color. Perfect, crisp lines every time. I mean, I know I just went through the entire process of building a boat out of a cattle trough, but put all that building aside, peeling this tape off was by far the most satisfying part of this entire build. I mean, look at it. Evel Knievel would be so happy right now. And when you have a boat that looks this cool, a boat that looks this extreme, this streamlined, this fast, dare I say this badass, it only makes sense that you pick out a name that's appropriate for such a craft. The Milk Dud. Because, you know, it's a cattle trough. Like cows drink water out of it, and, well, milk comes from cows, and I like milk duds. With the paint job done, the exterior of the boat was pretty much complete. There's just a few more things I had to do, one of which was mount the motor on the back. But in order to do that, I needed a place that I could, well, actually mount the motor to the back. So I taped a string to the very front of the boat, and I found the center line so that I could mount the motor exactly in the center of the back of the boat with the front because, well, that just seems like it makes sense and the boat would work a lot better that way. Then I riveted a piece of plywood on the inside and I screwed a piece of plywood on the outside, and I created a very rough transom, for lack of a better term, that I could mount the motor on top of. And then I decided a great paint job and a motor is all well and good, but if you don't have a place to sit, well, it's not going to be a very fun boat ride. So it was time to start working on the interior of the boat, which meant my bench seats. So using a ruler and a tape measure, I figured out the internal diameter of the boat, and I cut some half circles out of plywood. My idea is to mount one of these in the back to make a back bench, and then I'll cut another one and mount it at the front to make a front bench. Kind of something like this, only they're not going to be that low because your knees would need to be really, really bent and they might get sore. So to raise them up, I had to create some sort of bracing situation, lip, box thing that my half circles could sit on. So naturally, I ripped down a few pieces of plywood, I kerf cut the bejesus out of them so that I could bend them around that internal shape, and I riveted them to the inside. Now, you might be thinking, well, didn't those rivets go through the outside? Well, they didn't, because I have a 1/2 inch wiggle room between the outside metal and that outside skin. So I made sure just to have the rivets go inside that void and not poke out the outside. After getting my back brace piece on, I decided that I was going to need a back brace if I didn't lower this thing to the ground, because I was all hunched over leaning on the inside. So Craig helped me put it on the floor, and that way I could crawl inside. I added some brace pieces to the front, and now we were starting to get somewhere. I cut some more pieces of plywood. This is going to be the front of our box and support our bench seat just a little bit more. I did have to cut a nice angle at the end of each of those pieces so that it would fit in there with the curve of the cattle trough. Cut one on the back, I cut one on the front, and then I had to glue some brace pieces to the bottom of the trough because there was no way to attach wood to the bottom without poking out the bottom, and well, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of a boat if you have holes in it. I mean, the water would just come inside and then, well, it would be a submarine, not a boat. While I waited for the glue to dry on those pieces, I decided to make my seats a little more comfortable. So I got this upholstery foam at a local fabric store. I used my plywood as a template to trace out the general shape, making it just a little bit bigger than the plywood itself. And then I took some of this blue faux leather that I picked out because it matched the boat perfectly, dare I say. I don't know why I talked like that. I was trying to sound like a designer. Anyways, I did probably my worst upholstery job of all time, mainly because I don't know what I'm doing. I just pulled that faux leather around all the sides of my little half moon and I stapled it a zillion times. But for a cattle trough boat, I mean, it doesn't look that bad. By the time I was done upholstering my seats, my wood brace pieces were firmly glued to the bottom of the trough. I also painted these plywood pieces white so that they would match the rest of the boat. Now, one thing I had to consider was the gas tank for the motor. I wanted that towards the front of the boat because, well, that's where we're going to need the most weight. So I had to create a little notch to pass the fuel line through that piece into the other piece, and then it'll come up right underneath the motor. Now, I'm just assuming this is going to work. Believe it or not, this is my first time ever running a fuel line for an outboard motor in a cattle trough, so kind of flying by the seat of my pants here. I cut out this little notch so I could run the fuel line up against the side of the tank without it getting pinched. And before I did anything else, I wanted to install this nice teak floor. Now, I found this on Amazon. I hate to tell you this because I don't want to disappoint you, but it's not really teak. It's actually peel and stick foam. But it actually looks pretty good once you get it all adhered to the bottom and stretched out. I mean, unless you really told somebody, or if they were within 30 feet of it, they'd never know it wasn't real teak. It really classes the boat up. With my teak floor installed, the only thing left to do was to plop in place my newly upholstered bench seat covers. I did add a little lip to the bottom of each one of these so that it kind of would lock itself in place and you wouldn't slide off while you're getting bounced around in the lake. With that all done, Craig helped me lift it once again back up onto Sawhorses so that we could finally add the missing piece, the part that'll make it look, well, less like a cattle trough and just a little bit more like a boat. And that was our brand new, slightly used Mercury Pro Kicker 9.9. There's just something about a Mercury. This new motor fit perfect. I clamped it down and we hooked up the battery and she came to life. Oh golly, this thing's gonna work. The next morning we woke up bright and early, ready to go boating. And, well, it was a beautiful day for boating too. A crisp 26-degree November morning. Ooh, yeah. Let's go out on the open water. Now, because of the weird shape of this boat, naturally, I don't have a boat trailer that's going to fit it very well. So I borrowed my neighbor's flatbed trailer, which actually did work pretty good because, the bottom of the boat is also flat. We strapped that thing down and we headed for the lake. The sea was not calm that day. In fact, the water whipped around as the wind blew across its surface, making little white caps, almost like Santa's, except there was no red or fluffy white balls at the end of it. We strapped our Mercury 9.9 outboard motor onto our cattle trough boat, and we gave it a test with its electric trim. Everything seemed to be working great. The old trailer creaked as it inched the boat closer to the water. We couldn't help but notice the irony of this situation as the cattle trough approached the shore, for it was no longer something to be filled with water, but something to glide across it.
Well, here we are. After over a month of construction, the milk dud is done and we're ready to launch. But before we do that, every boat needs a christening. For that, we've decided to use 2% milk. Why? Well, because it's a cattle trough. Milk dud.